In this video, I will show you how to make the Feeling Loopy Mini Crop Top. This is from my Feeling Loopy pattern. The Feeling Loopy pattern comes with 3 views: the dress view, the top view, and the mini crop top view. In this video, I will just show you how to make the Feeling Loopy Mini Crop Top view. If you want to make one of the other views, I'll have 2 separate videos for those views. That being said, the steps in this video are going to be corresponding directly to the steps in your instruction booklet. The instructions go through every single view in order, so there's going to be some steps that you skip if you're only working on the mini crop top view. So don't be alarmed if you're going from step like 5 to step 12 or something like that, and you're just skipping a bunch of steps. That's what you're supposed to do if you're only working on the mini crop top view, because you don't need to do the steps that are related to the dress view or the top view. So this video is just for the mini crop top view. In addition to the views, you'll be able to choose between wide strap ties or narrow straps. The video will show you both, and so you'll see a banner at the top of the video that will say wide straps option or narrow straps option. Just follow the ones that apply to the options you're choosing to make. You can jump ahead by following the timestamps in the caption below the video or in the bar below where there's little dots, and you can skip ahead to the options that you're working on. In the video, I'll be making the narrow straps view, and I'll insert some video of me making the dress with the wide strap view, but the sewing construction is the exact same for the wide straps on the dress or the mini crop top, so don't be confused if you see me making the dress view for a second. It's just to show you what the wide strap ties are like. Besides that, you'll also see that there's multiple choices within the video, so you will have 2 options for seam finishes, and I'm just going to show you one, but I'll pop up the illustrations from the instruction booklet for both options so that you can have a visual reference of the 2 different options that you could use for the seam finish. The reason for this is one of my goals with Forest and Thread was to teach people to make really high-end garments. Seam finishes are what takes a garment from being kind of like a basic level to a really high-end level. Feel free to ignore any seam finishes you don't want to do and just use an overlock or zigzag stitch to finish your raw edges, or go ahead and practice your skills and learn something new and try the bias binding or the French seam, and it'll be there in the video and you can ignore it if you want to. It's totally up to you. Throughout the video, I'll be referencing those higher end seam finishes that I'm talking about. I made separate videos for each of the seam finishes. So there's a separate video for a French seam, how to make continuous bias tape, how to sew a bias binding around a seam, and there's even another video for how to gather. If you're someone who hasn't really had much experience with gathering, then I have a separate video for all of those details. They will all be linked. They'll all be available on my channel, and that way you can just pull up those videos in a separate tab and you can just bounce back and forth throughout the video so that you can watch them as many times as you need, and you can even reference them when you're doing another project. I kind of like the idea of creating a stitch library for you, so you have like a resource guide of all the types of seam finishes that I teach you in my patterns. And so my YouTube channel, I'll just keep building this resource library of different seam finishing techniques. This is kind of like my first stab at doing that. So let me know what you think of that. The Feeling Loopy Mini Crop Top is a super quick sew. It's a lot of tiny pieces, so you can squeeze it out of a little bit of fabric, and it's actually perfect as the first step in making the Feeling Loopy pattern because you can fit the bodice with a little bit of fabric and still have something wearable, and then move on to the dress or the top view. So welcome if it's your first pattern, and I look forward to seeing what you make. Okay, thank you, bye. The following are the materials you will need to make the Feeling Loopy Mini Crop Top. Your self fabric or your main fabric. You should use a lightweight to midweight woven material. Lightweight fusible interfacing. This is just needed for the bodice outer layer, and the wide strap ties if you're choosing to use the wide strap ties. You'll need matching thread to your fabric. An optional step is adding foam bra cups within the bodice outer layer and the bodice lining. Foam bra cups are available in various sizes, so order one according to your personal sizing. Prepare your pattern for your chosen view and chosen size. I like to use a notch cutter to cut out the notches along the edges of the pattern. This makes it easier for marking your fabric. I also like to use a screw punch, which is a really handy tool for marking areas within the pattern. I'm going to use it for the dart point. Prepare your fabric. You should wash and dry your fabric according to how you will wash and dry your garment, and then press your fabric. Cut out your fabric according to the size, layout, and view that you are making. Cut out your interfacing. If you are making the wide strap tie version, then you're going to want to cut out interfacing of your wide strap tie pattern piece. If you're using a thicker fabric, you may be able to skip this step. I just like how it reinforces a lighter weight fabric for keeping the straps nice and neat. Mark your notches. Make sure to mark the center front notch on any pattern pieces that are cut on the fold. Using the appropriate iron setting for your fabric choice, lay your front bodice fabric face down and your matching interfacing piece glue side down on top. I'm using a press cloth because I find that this interfacing specifically kind of rubs off on my iron and it sticks to it on the back side. Repeat this method for your back bodice pieces, and repeat it again for your bottom bodice band pieces. If you are using the wide strap ties, repeat this method for all 4 of these pieces as well. For the Feeling Loopy Mini Crop Top, you're going to need bias tape. I like to go ahead and make continuous bias tape at the beginning of my sewing project so that I can just wrap it around scrap paper or scrap cardboard and then set it aside for later when I need it within the sewing construction steps. You can check out my other video for how to make continuous bias tape. Fold your narrow straps and back ties in half lengthwise with right sides together and pin in place along the raw edges. Sew your narrow straps and back ties along the raw edges using a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance. If needed, due to stiffer fabrics, trim your excess seam allowance down to 1/8 inch or 3 mm. Using either a super tiny safety pin or loop turner, which I'm using here, turn your narrow straps and back ties right side out. Press your narrow straps and back ties flat with the seam directly on the edge. Repeat these steps for all 6 pieces and set aside for later. Fold your wide strap ties in half lengthwise with right sides together and pin along the long edges. Sew along the length of your wide strap ties using 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Pivot your needle at the corner and sew along the short edge of your wide strap ties using 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/4 inch along that short edge. Trim your corner at a 45-degree angle in order to make a nice crisp corner. Turn your wide strap ties right side out. I like to use a bobby pin to push the sewn short edge down into the tubular tie. You can also use a knitting needle or a chopstick to do this as well. Use the bobby pin end to push out the finished corners, hold the tie vertical with the open end at the bottom and let the bobby pin drop out. Press your seam directly on the edge. Repeat this for all 4 ties and set aside for later. Transfer the dart point onto the wrong side of your front bodice pieces. You may also want to transfer the dart legs to help guide you as you sew. The seam allowance here is 1/4 inch or 6 mm. With right sides facing, pin the dart edges together. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance from the dart opening to the point. I'm adding a pin to the very point, and then I'm going to slightly curve my dart legs so that it helps to avoid any pointy dart situation. You may also find it helpful to read the additional tips in the sewing instructions for how to avoid pointy darts. Leave your threads long and then tie a double knot at the dart tip. And then trim your threads. Using a tailor's ham or a rolled up towel to create a curved surface safe for ironing, press the seam allowance down along the dart. Make sure the dart point is being gently pressed into a curved shape. It's good to pull the dart point nice and taut. With right sides facing, pin your front bodice and back bodice together along the side edges. Match the interfaced front bodice with the interfaced back bodice. Make sure the single notches are on the top and the double notches are on the bottom edge to ensure the correct orientation of both pieces. The back bodice doesn't have any notches along the side edge. Sew together with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Grade your seam allowance. And press your seam allowance away from the front bodice. Pin one narrow strap to each of the notches on the top edge of your interfaced back bodice pieces. Make sure to pin them to the right side of your back bodice with the strap coming down away from the top edge. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Bring the other end of each strap to the notches on the top edge of your interfaced front bodice piece. Be careful not to twist the strap. Make sure to pin them to the right side of the front bodice with the strap coming down away from the top edge. You may want to do a quick fitting here and double check that the strap length is correct for your personal preference. Trim the strap length accordingly. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Pin the remaining back ties to each of the notches along the center back edge on the interfaced back bodice pieces. You want 2 straps attached to each side so that you can tie them closed while wearing. Make sure to pin them to the right side of the back bodice with the straps coming away from the side edge. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. For extra strength and security, you may wish to add a little scrap of interfacing over each end of the narrow straps and back ties, where you've attached them to the bodice. Cut 8 little rectangle pieces approximately 1 inch by 3/8 of an inch, or 2.5 centimeters by 1 centimeter in size. Adhere the fusible interfacing to the right side of the garment directly over where you have attached the straps, within the seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. Pin the short raw edge of the wide strap tie to each of the notches on the top edge of your interfaced front bodice and back bodice piece. Make sure to pin them to the face side of the bodice pieces with the straps coming down away from the top edge. Center the wide strap ties directly over the notches. You may want to do a quick fitting here and double check the strap placement along the top edge. The wide strap ties are intended to cover a bra strap. If you plan to wear this garment with a bra, try on the bodice piece over your bra and adjust the strap placement accordingly. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Sew your mini ruffle pieces together along the short edges, which will become your center front seam and side seams, in order to create one long rectangle. Finish the seams with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is a French seam. Option 2 is to use an overlock or zigzag stitch. I'm going to sew a French seam. You can see my other video for more detailed instructions for how to sew a French seam. Press the finished seam in one direction. Hem your ruffle along one of the long edges by folding under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric and pressing. Fold under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters a second time to completely enclose the raw edge. Press again. Finish the remaining 2 short edges, which will become your center back edges. Fold the edge under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric and press. Fold another 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters under along the same edge to completely enclose the raw edge. Press again. Sew an edge stitch along the entire length of the ruffle. Sew an edge stitch along the short edges as well. Sewing with a basting stitch length of approximately 4 to 5, stitch along the top edge. The top edge is the only remaining raw edge. Stitch along the top edge of your mini ruffle pieces with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, as well as a 5/8 inch and 16 millimeter seam allowance. Sew each of the mini ruffle pieces top edge separately to make the gathering easier. Leave your beginning and ending threads extra long. Gather your piece until the top edge measures 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters less than equal length to the bottom edge of your front bodice and back bodice pieces. Make sure your center front seam lines up with the center front notch on your front bodice. Match the side seams as well. Line up the center back finished edge of your mini ruffle pieces 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters away from the center back raw edges of your back bodice pieces. If you need more help, follow my other video for how to gather. Bring your interfaced front bodice and back bodice pieces right sides together with the gathered mini ruffle piece. Match the bottom edge of your bodice to the top gathered edge of your ruffle and pin in place. Set your stitch length back to a regular amount of approximately 2.5 to 3 millimeters and sew along your pinned edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your two basting stitch lines. Remove the basting stitches with a seam ripper and thread scissors. With right sides facing, pin together two mirrored bottom bodice band pieces along the center front middle notched edge. Make sure to match the inner faced bottom bodice band pieces together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open. Bring the right side of your interfaced bottom bodice band piece to the wrong side of your assembled garment along the bodice seam line. Match the top notched edge of your bottom bodice band to the bottom layer of your bodice seam. The bottom layer should be sandwiched in between the bottom bodice band and the front bodice and back bodice pieces. Pin together matching notches along the way. Match the side seam notch on your bottom bodice band to the side seam on your front bodice and back bodice. Match the center front seam on your bottom bodice band to the center front notch on your front bodice. Sew along this pinned edge through all the layers using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Sew with your bodice pieces facing up so you can use the previously sewn stitch line as your guide. Grade your seam allowances. Press your seam allowance up towards the front bodice and back bodice. With right sides facing, bring together the remaining front bodice and back bodice pieces to the remaining bottom bodice band pieces. Match the top notched edge of your bottom bodice band piece to the bottom edge of your front bodice and back bodice pieces. Pin together, matching notches along the way. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press your seam allowance down towards the bottom bodice band. This piece will now be referred to as your bodice lining. Your inner faced front bodice and back bodice will now be referred to as your outer bodice piece. Trim off 1/8 inch or 3mm from the top edge of your bodice lining. This will help keep the bodice lining layer hidden within the outer bodice layer. With right sides facing, bring your bodice lining to your outer bodice piece along the top edge. Match the center back edges, side seams, and center front notches. Make sure the straps are sandwiched in between the layers and not twisted. The center back ties should be sandwiched in between the layers as well. Pin along the top edge, matching notches along the way. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press the seam allowance towards the bodice lining. I find it helpful to use a tailor's ham. Sew an understitch along the stitch line on the bodice lining side, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. Fold the bodice lining back towards the outer bodice with right sides facing. Make sure the center back ties are sandwiched in between the layers. Pin the center back edges together, matching the bodice seam. The bottom layer should not be caught in this center back seam, rather just outside of it so it can hang freely. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Fold your upper corner neatly and then turn your piece right side out. You may wish to trim your corners if you are using a stiff fabric. Press your seams to be directly on the edges, slightly rolling inwards along the top edge due to the understitch. You may wish to add top stitching to the top edge of the bodice to help keep everything in place and to add extra strength to your straps. This is an optional step for adding foam bra cups. If you wish to add foam bra cups, try on your garment now and slip the bra cups in between the outer bodice and the bodice lining layers. Place the bra cups accordingly for your own personal preference. Pin them in place while fitting. After removing the garment, double check the placement feels relatively symmetrical to the center front, and then move the pins to the right side of the bodice lining layer only. I'm specifically pinning around the dart area and the bodice seam area, as well as one pin at the top underneath the strap. Stitch in the ditch, only sewing through the bodice lining and the foam bra cup. Sew along the dart seam to secure the foam bra cup in place. Sew along the bodice seam as well. You may wish to add a small stitch line at the top of the bra cup directly underneath the strap placement as well. Bring the outer bodice and bodice lining layers together along the bottom edge, which is the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces. Measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters along your bias tape, and then begin pinning your bias tape right sides facing to the bottom edges of your bottom bodice band pieces. When you make it around the entire bottom edge, measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters again from the center back edge along the bias tape, and then trim your bias tape. Sew using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Trim the bias tape that extends past the center back edge by 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Continue trimming 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters off the seam allowance. Press the bias tape away from the bottom bodice band pieces. Flip your piece to be right side down. Fold your bias tape in 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters along the raw edges and press. Fold the very ends of your extra bias tape that continues past the center back edges under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters for an easy finished edge as you sew. Fold your bias tape over your raw seam allowance, completely enclosing it with the bias tape, and press in place. Make sure to keep the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters folded under. You may wish to pin your bias tape in place from the right side. Alternatively, you can use a basting stitch or you can use basting glue to secure your bias tape before sewing an edge stitch from the right side of the bodice lining. Sew an edge stitch along the bias tape, catching the folded bias tape on the underside of your piece. Continue stitching the additional length of bias tape past the center back edges by sewing an edge stitch to keep the bias tape neatly folded into a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter strings. For the back ties option, finish the raw ends of your center back ties by pushing in a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters of fabric within the tubular end. I like to use the tip of my thread scissors to push in the raw edges of my fabric. You can either sew using an edge stitch or hand sew a ladder stitch to secure the ends in place.